And many thanks to Fred as well for accepting our invitation to share his research with us today. So before this interesting talk, I will start with a brief introduction about our speaker, Dr. Frédéric De Geuser. Fred is a CNRS researcher based at the French National Center for Scientific Research from University of Grenoble-Alpes. Fred has extensive experience in precipitation work, both in modeling and characterizations, covering some advanced techniques, including APT and small angle X-ray scattering. And today, Fred is going to talk about the precipitation trajectories in structural alloys mapped by small angle X-ray scattering. So now let's welcome Fred to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I hope I'll be able to visit you in person sometimes when everything gets better in the situation. But for now, it's really a pleasure to give this talk for you guys. So, as was previously said, my name is Fred De Geuser. And I work in Grenoble. So this is the city you can see in my first slide there. So right now we're more in the right situation with a very hot sun on our head, but it's a really nice city. So please feel free to visit when you want. Be happy to have you. And what I wanted to talk to you about is about something that I really like, and that has been some sort of main topic on my research for this last few years, which is the notion of precipitation trajectories in structural alloys. So first, I'd like to thank the contributors of this talk. So on the left, you see PhD students and postdocs who have worked with me and others on this topic for the last few years. And I must also mention a few colleagues, Alexis Deschamps from Grenoble as well, who has been a colleague of mine working on this topic for many years. Christophe Sigli is working at Constellium, and as you will see, I will be presenting examples of industrial alloys, and he's been following these studies with us. And also someone you'll be more familiar with, Batko, who I think is now in the audience actually, with whom I've been working for the last 20 years nearly, especially on things that are some sort of pet projects of both he and myself, Atom Probe and SAX. And if I've scheduled, normally I should be talking about it, but if maybe I will be running a bit out of time, so maybe I will skip this part, but you will be able to discuss with Matt about this anyway. So what do I mean when I said precipitation trajectories? Well, the general ideas, what's very interesting in this thing is that this is a very fundamental topic. It's a problem of phase transformation in solids, in metals. The fact that when there is a phase transformation, when there is precipitation in a metal, what usually happens is that this transformation doesn't happen all at once. There is what's called a metastability cascade or a precipitation sequence. And you have all seen this graph in your studies or maybe in more recent times, but anyway, this is very classical. You want to form a very stable phase, but this stable phase is very slow to form because it has a very large nucleation barrier. So the system will actually form phases which are metastable phase, which are much more faster to form because the nucleation barrier is lower. What's very interesting here is that this fundamental topic, which is actually more or less understood in the principle, but not on the details, has still very strong influence and is very important in very applied materials such as precipitation strengthened aluminum alloys, which will be the body of this presentation. So I will use this as an example of what I mean by precipitation trajectories and how we can study them. and most especially this alloy, which is an aluminum copper lithium alloys, which contains also other solutes, and which is used for aerospace industry, as we'll discuss later on. In this alloy, for a particular alloy, what we want is to go from a solid solution to this T1 phase, which is the so-called desired phase, the one that has the most desired mechanical properties. But the system will actually go through different metastable phases in the way to this T1 phase, and they will actually affect the mechanical properties as well, etc. But what's more interesting is that this is a multi-constituent alloy. Well, there are many elements in this alloy, and because of copper, lithium, mag, silver, etc. And because of this, there are other possible systems which also have their metastable phases that are actually that may form actually, like aluminum from the aluminum lithium system, from the aluminum copper mag system, etc. So what interests me really is how the system actually choose one of these many trajectories in the phase space, and how you can actually control the way it switch from one trajectory from the other. So really, you can act on this and choose one trajectory to the other. And if you want to understand this, you rapidly understand that you'll need a tool to characterize how the system moves, so the kinetics of the transformation. And this tool of choice, in our case, will be small angle X-ray scattering, or SAX. So forgive me of the way I pronounce SAX, so it may sound funny sometimes. That's just my French accent, you'll have to deal with it. So SAX is really a very, very simple experiment. It's the most simplest setups you could think of. You take an incident beam and you send it on your sample, which should be thin enough to be transparent to your beam. So in our case, it will be X-rays. You send it to on your sample, and the sample scatters the beam, and you detect it on a detector. Okay. So this very simple setup is actually nothing else than a diffraction setup. Okay. So this actually pretty much looks like what you would get in a TEM. Really, you have an incident beam that would be electrons in this way, transparent sample, and a detector. Okay. And what you have here is a diffraction of your sample. Okay, so in a sense, what you will get on your detector would be, for instance, Bragg peaks. Here, we're not interested in Bragg peaks. We're interested into things that scatters at much smaller angles. So if you want smaller angles, you put your detector further away. So you put it very far away. And if you put it far away from the sample, you have small angles, smaller than the Bragg peaks. And it means that you're in a Fourier space, in a reciprocal space. So if you have smaller angles than the Bragg peaks, it means that you're studying larger distances than the interatomic distances. So in this, at this scale, the system can be considered as being continuous. And what you're interested in is really the distribution of solutes. And if it's homogeneous, you have nothing. If it's heterogeneous, you have some sort of diffuse signal that will look like this on your 2D detector. And you will sort of integrate this, and you're left with a curve that you have to interpret. So this is a reciprocal space technique, so it needs an interpretation model. You can't really just see what you want. So it means really that you need to combine this technique with other techniques, real space techniques, mostly microscopy, APT, etc. But if you have an interpretation model, let's say we have precipitates, spherical precipitates, you can parameterize this interpretation model, fit it to your data, and extract typically the size and the volume fraction. And since this is a non-destructive technique, then you can do in situ model, in situ experiments. It means you can actually insert here around your sample any type of sample environment you wish. A furnace, for instance, a tensile rig, whatever. So you can do in situ experiments. And in our case here, we'll do quite a bit of in situ heating. So just simply do heat treatments during the SAX. So let's describe this alloy that we will be using as an example. So this is an aluminum lithium copper alloy, a base alloy, let's say. And in this alloy, there is lithium, lithium and copper mainly, but there's also other elements, and we'll discuss what they do later on. And what's very interesting here is that, so it's used in the aerospace industry quite heavily, actually. And what's interesting is that it's strengthened by precipitates, and these precipitates are not non-spherical. They're non-spherical at all, actually. They look like this. So if you zoom on them, this is a HADF image here on the right. This is one of these precipitates, and it's actually perpendicular to the screen. So you can imagine a very thin plate. So really a plate which is about 1 nanometer in thickness and more than 100 nanometers in diameter. And here it's perpendicular to the screen. So you have plenty of these, and they are in 4 variants of orientation in space. So they actually form a very intricate network that is very potent, strengthening, what's the obstacle for the dislocations to move. And that's the interesting thing, is that we're looking at strengthening mechanism there, which are, again, if you look at textbooks, usually described like this, where you have spherical precipitates and they interact with dislocations, and you have essentially 2 mechanisms, one is which is shearing and one which is bypassing. But here, how does it translate with these kind of precipitates, which are very large? Can you have the same kind of shearing to bypassing transition that explains the peak in strength? We'll see if we can look at this later on. But so this kind of morphology causes experimental challenges, but also modeling challenges, and we'll try to discuss both of these. But first, a word on what it means to do SACs on non-spherical precipitates. So here we have these TEM images, TEM image of our samples, and we have these very thin lines, the T1s we've been discussing, and we actually have also. So these are the T1s, and they're in the 111 planes of aluminum. We also have theta primes, and theta primes are also plates. It's another type of precipitates, metastable precipitates, and they are in the opposite direction here. So in the other diagonal. So there are actually 2 types of precipitates in this image. And if you look at the diffraction pattern there, they are both plates. So something that is flat in real space, it gives something elongated in the reciprocal space, and this is why you see streakings in this diffraction pattern. So the Fourier transform of something flat is something elongated. Now, if you put this in SACs, you do a Fourier transform, and now you don't have a single crystal like in TEM. You have a real sample which has many orientations, many grains. But if you have some sort of moderate texture and in some direction that are preferential, then you will have streaks that corresponds to the directions of the precipitates that you actually have in your beam, of the different grains that you have in your beam. If you have no texture, so what crystallographers call a powder, so very small grains in all orientation, then all these streaks will actually average out, and you'll get something that is isotropic, not because of the objects, but because of a distribution of orientation of the objects. And if you have a strong texture, then you will have something that looks like this, which actually looks much more like the diffraction pattern of the TEM. And here it's very interesting, because now we have a way to actually separate the contribution of different precipitates. So because different habit planes of the precipitates will actually give a streak in a different direction in this kind of SACs pattern. So here we have the T1s, which are the very bright one, and the faint one are the theta primes in the other orientation. And also, so it can separate the contribution. But it can also give you not only volume fraction with the intensity, but it also gives you the thickness. It means the further the streak goes, the thinner the precipitates. And also, the broader the streak is, the shorter the precipitate. So it gives you the information on both directions. So it's very nice, because now we have a way to actually separate contribution in SACs, which was a problem, because as we said, a SACs experiment gives you just the general contribution of everything in one single image, and then it's usually hard to separate them. So now we can actually study how one phase competes with the other, And so we're getting closer to studying precipitation sequences. So here, what I've done is I've prepared a sample, an initial state, which contains only theta prime, so one of the phase. And I age it at 155 degrees. And at the end of this aging, I have mostly T1s this time, so in the other direction. And if I do this in situ in SACS, this is the kind of images I get. So that's the starting point. I have mostly the theta prime streaks. And at the end, I have mostly the T1s, just still a bit of theta prime. And this is the 16 hours video of what's going on during the heating. So you can really see the precipitation happening and the theta prime taking over, the T1s taking over at the expense of the theta prime. So now you can actually exploit every single images of this in situ experiment and extract volume fraction and sizes of both phases as a function of time. This is what we have done, and this is the results. And you see here volume fraction, size, and number density of T1 in blue, theta prime in red. So you see T1 taking over and theta prime getting close to 0. And you can really extract every interesting parameters as a function of time. I can draw your attention to on this curve here, which is the T1 thickness as a function of time. And you can see that it's actually very, very constant at about 1 nanometer. And this 1 nanometer corresponds to these images there. So when there is only 1 unit cell of T1. So very interestingly, these T1 nucleate at this temperature, at least. They nucleate on a plane, and then they grow only on this plane, and they never thicken. So that's very, very interesting. Now, something else I wanted to show you. Here we have seen in situ experiments where we see competition between these different phases. There is actually a way to have different precipitation trajectory on a single sample, so without the time. And this I will show you with the example of a study we did on joining. In this case, it was friction steel welding on aluminum, lithium, copper, still the same type of alloys. And friction steel welding is where you actually insert between your two sheets a tool that rotates, and this rotation and with pressure will actually input a lot of deformation and heating in your materials, and because of this there will be a recrystallized zone in between the two sheets that will actually make the joining very nice. And these sheets are strengthened by precipitation, the precipitation of the T1 precipitates we've discussed. So there's the nugget, which is recrystallized, and far away from the nugget, we have those T1s we've discussed. And if you scan, you take a slice of your weld, and you do a scanning with your SACS beam, and you do a SACS experiment on each position. This is what I show here. Here I've shown only about 1/10 of the images, but I've put them at the right position, knowing that this is about a sample of 2 centimeters height. Okay, so there's about 5,000 images in this in reality, and you can see that far away we have these sort of stars pattern that I've shown you before, corresponding to T1s. And at the middle, we have something that is more diffuse, and this is because the T1s have actually been dissolved. And if I superimpose the recrystallized nugget here, you see that there is a zone where everything is dissolved, and there is an intermediate zone, which is an affected zone, where there is an intermediate situation. So you can actually, you see that it corresponds well to a micro-hardness map that I've shown here, where there is a drop on hardness at the center of the map. And if you interpret each image, the 5,000 image independently, and you can fit again the size and volume fraction of the precipitates, and you see here the fraction here, for instance, that there is a zone where the precipitates have entirely been dissolved, and you see that close to these zones, before dissolving completely, they get thickened very much. And this dissolution of T1 corresponds to the drop in precipitate, in hardness, in micro hardness. Okay, so you can interpret this pretty easily by saying, okay, there is heat which is introduced by the welding, and this heat dissolves the precipitates. So maybe it's not a very good idea to actually do the welding on sheets that have been precipitated already. Maybe it's a better idea to do it before the precipitation treatment and then weld. And this is what we have been doing here. So here we do the welding and then we do the precipitation treatment. And we see that we still have a drop, which is a bit better, but not perfect in hardness. And if you look at the precipitation distribution, we still have a very large drop in precipitates here at the center. And more interestingly, the shape of this drop doesn't have the same shape than in the earlier cases. So it's actually not that simple. And the difference comes from the role of the deformation, the role of dislocation on the nucleation of this T1. Actually, these T1 precipitates are hexagonal precipitates, and they need for this hexagonal structure to nucleate on an FCC 111 plane. We need a stacking fault, and this stacking fault will actually be introduced by the dissociation of a dislocation in two partials, in between which there will be a stacking fault. And because of this, if you look at the base material, which has been pre-deformed, it actually nucleates T1 very easily because you have introduced dislocation to nucleate T1. But in the nugget, there is not enough dislocations to nucleate T1. And because of this, you don't have only T1, you also have theta prime. So you have T1s and theta primes. And because of this, the mechanical properties are actually lower than in the base materials. So here we see that in this example, this one single sample, we have already very different precipitation trajectories, because we have the base material, which have seen dislocations and nucleation of essentially T1, and then the base materials where there is no dislocations because we have recrystallized the material. And then in this case, only T1s and theta prime, both T1 and theta primes have nucleated. And since they compete on the same solutes, well, they are less of both of them. Okay, so we've seen that we can control the T1 nucleation with dislocations. So can we go a bit further with this? So we'll actually introduce different levels of pre-deformation on our samples before the precipitation treatments, and look at them with in situ heating in sacks. And this is the kind of things we obtain. So we have three levels of deformation here, and depending on the levels of deformation, we would age them 155, and we see that we have different. Well, we obtained the same volume fraction here for the three-level deformation, but interestingly, we obtained them for very different levels of diameter, of length. So we have much larger precipitates when we have fewer dislocations, and much smaller precipitates when we have a lot of dislocations. And it also shows in the number density, where we have much more precipitates if you have a large number of dislocations. So it sort of makes sense. You introduce a lot of nucleation sites, so you have a lot of precipitates, and then because there are a lot of them, they actually hinder the growth of each other. They block each other, and they remain smaller. And again, interestingly, they all remain at about 1 nanometer thickness, so they all remain at 1 unit cell. So that's very interesting, because now we have a way actually to tailor the distribution and the quantity and the distribution of T1, which we can actually use to study their strengthening mechanism. And this is what we have been doing here. First, a quick word about can we actually make them thicken, make them go a bit further than 1 unit cell? Well, yes, you can. For this, you need to activate the thickening. So you need to increase the temperature. So here we did 2 steps aging. That's the pink curve there, where we do 155. And at this point, we increase the temperature 190, and we see if you look at the thickness there, thickness is constant, 155, and if you increase the temperature, then you start increasing the thickness of the precipitates. Okay, so you see, if you compare the green and the pink, that's around the change in temperature, there will be a very complex change of microstructure with everything changing at the same time, number density, length, thickness, etc. Well, if you do this, we see that we can actually reproduce the yield strength by a very simple model, which is represented in blue here, which is only a shearing model where when you shear your precipitates, you create a new interface. And if you do this, you can reproduce the increase, but you can also reproduce this very small area here, which is actually much more complex than expected, because everything is changing at the same time here. So you actually don't need a transition between shearing to bypassing, as you can read in every textbook, to explain this peak in strength. This is all explained by a change mostly in morphology, actually. The drop of yield strength occurs when T1 gets thicker. Only at the end, at very overaged states, do our model diverge from experimental data, probably because at this point, in very overaged sample, there will be some sort of shearing to bypassing transition. But down to all these points, the precipitates are only sheared and not bypassed. So we've seen the role of dislocations. Now, can we end the role of temperature in a way? Can we have a look at the role of composition? And not the main composition, but really the secondary addition elements, the minor elements. So in these alloys, there is aluminum, lithium, and copper. So we'll take the same base and we'll vary the minor elements, which are mostly magnesium and silver, and also other elements. So why are we interested into this? That's because normally T1 nucleation is actually very difficult, but if you add a bit of mag and silver, then it gets much easier. And that's very interesting because we don't really know why. There have been hypotheses. One is the decrease in stacking fault energy. One is the fact that there are segregation formed at the interfaces of mag and silver, so it may change the growth, etc. One is the potential formation of precursors that have also been observed by APT. So there are different possibilities. If you prepare those samples with the same aluminum, copper, lithium base and you vary the minor elements, so we're really speaking about secondary addition elements, mostly 0.3% of silver as compared to about 4% of lithium. So that's really not a lot. You see that it actually changes a lot. There's essentially two groups. One is without mag and one is with mag. So there's really a very important role of magnesium. And this role of magnesium, so where am I? Sorry. Yep, sorry. So I think I missed a few precipitate, but that doesn't really matter. This role of magnesium has been shown to be really due to the formation of these precursors here that actually changes the nucleation sites for T1 precipitates and actually favor T1s as at the expense of theta prime. So really, as a conclusion on this part, I would like to say that we can see that we can actually control precipitation trajectory and make the system switch from one precipitation trajectory to the other by a few. We have here studied a few switch. One which was the temperature. If you change the temperature, you can favor theta prime as a function of T1. It's sort of sounds a bit self-evident, but it wasn't that clear. There's of course the role of composition, but more interestingly, including the role of minor elements and the role of predeformation, dislocation. What's very important on this, really the take-home message, is that on these aspects, thinking about thermodynamic only as a grid of lecture is not enough. It doesn't explain everything, doesn't explain much actually. What's important are the kinetics aspects. So if you want to switch precipitation trajectory, what you need to do is to change the kinetic conditions and essentially nucleation conditions, also growth conditions, in order to be able to favor one phase or the other. So the reading of the phase diagrams or DFT calculations of energies, etc., is actually not enough to actually understand what's going on. So because of this, it's very important to get a very good characterization of the kinetics of the reaction in situ, if possible. So this is why I hope I convince you that SACS is a very interesting technique, but that it can't really be used alone. It needs real space ex situ experiments as well, TEM, atom probe, etc. And this actually makes the transition to the last part of the talk, which is something that I like to work with because it combines my two preferred techniques, which are SACS and atom probe, and that's the idea of making really dialogues and interplay between reciprocal space and direct space with using these two techniques, SACS and atom probe. So why does it work and why is it interesting? Well, in the reciprocal space, there's SACS, and SACS, this is it works like this. So this sort of general equation is like this. I'll show it again later on. But if you inject an interpretation model, for instance, spheres, it doesn't really matter how, it will all come down to this kind of equation here, where the intensity as a function of the scattering vector depends on three factors. One, which is the blue one here, is something that depends only on the geometry of your objects. So spheres, plates, cylinders, rods, you name it. Here, this is the case for spheres, but it doesn't really matter. And then, as a factor of all this, there is a term of volume fraction, of quantity. The more you have, the more intensity you have. And there's also a factor of contrast, scattering contrast, which depends on the difference in electronic density between the precipitate and the matrix. And for us, to simplify a little bit, it really depends essentially on the concentration contrast between the precipitates and the matrix. Okay, so the more precipitates you have, the more they will scatter. But of course, the more contrast they have, the more they will scatter. And if there is no contrast, it doesn't matter how much precipitates you have, there will be no intensity. But still, importantly, if there is a little bit of contrast, you can always obtain the size from your SACS pattern, even if you don't know the compositions. But if you don't know the compositions, you can't obtain volume fractions because they are in fact in factor with the scattering contrast. Right, and then you can also see in this slide the correspondence between the intensity in the reciprocal space, which is what we actually measure in SACS, and the equivalent in the direct space, which is a so-called correlation function. Okay, so I'll get back to this in a later slide. Okay. So we need compositions to get volume fraction. For this, what we usually do is use atom probe. So we're actually atom probe users. So you guys normally, you people all more or less know about atom probe. You probably heard about it. So the idea of atom probe is to get composition mostly. This is really a tool for getting compositions. Here we'll get another examples of another aluminum alloys, which is also precipitation strengthened aluminum alloys. And on this alloy, we will do a two-step aging. First 120 degrees, and then 180 degrees after some times. And you will see here in SACS the evolution of the size. And for this, I don't need any other information. I can just fit my data, and this is what I get. You see that the size increases slowly, and when you increase the temperature, it will increase faster, which sort of makes sense. But if I want to have volume fraction, I need to do atom probe experiments, and this is what I did in collaboration with Huan Zhao and Bat. in Düsseldorf, and these are examples of reconstructions that they obtained. And you see that the precipitates they obtained are actually quite different, and especially in terms of composition. If you look at the amount of solutes, it's actually much higher in this case here than in this case here, and this corresponds to different states, the end of the reaction or the beginning of the reaction. And if you inject those composition in the Sachs interpretation model, you get very different volume fractions, either 10-ish% or either 2-ish%. Okay, so in fact, what composition should we choose? Is it constant during the reaction? Well, the answer is no. We have a composition that is evoluting. So even though we do in situ Sachs, we have a problem, which is the fact that for this we should need an in situ evaluation of the composition, okay? Because it actually evolves with time. That's the problem with metastability cascade. There is an evolution from GP zones, eta double prime, eta prime, etc. So I spoke about correlation functions. Correlation functions are what? If you have fluctuations of concentrations in your matrix, being due to either just fluctuations like these, spinodal, clustering, whatever, or actually well-formed precipitates like this. If you do a correlation function, an autocorrelation of this, you will have something that looks like this. It will be pretty much the same in both cases, something that decreases and go down to zero. And the breadth there is about the width of the correlation objects that you see, okay? Interestingly, what we measure in Sachs is the Fourier transform of this correlation function. But even more interestingly, this kind of correlation function can be calculated in atom probe, and they're usually called in this community radial distribution function, RDFs. So we see that actually both things, intensity for Sachs and RDF for APT, are the actual same objects, and we conclude from this that Sachs and APT speak the same language. And we'll actually explore this by using the same kind of formalism that that say the Sachs community usually use, which is the fact that we try to build an interpretation model that we parameterize and fit it to our intensity. Well, here in this case, what we have done is that we have parameterized an RDF model, a correlation function model, that we have fit to our data, which is what you can see here. And that actually enabled us to get volume fraction, number density, size, etc., as a function of time from atom probe data set by using the very same formalism that we used for Sachs. So that was very interesting. The one thing that we could do from this was that we could directly compare the sizes that we obtained from APT from ex situ APT, obviously, to in situ Sachs that we showed earlier. And we see here that the agreement is actually very good, except for very overage sample, mostly because the sizes are very big, and also for local magnification effect that we can discuss if you're interested in. So we see here that we have actually a tool to actually assess maybe the quality of the APT reconstructions, for instance, and or assess the effective spatial resolution in real space sample, in real experiments, not in specially chosen experiments to show the best spatial resolution of the experiments, as would be done, for instance, by a manufacturer to showcase their experiment, to showcase their instrument. So this is what we have done with BAT, where we tried to put together every experiments for which we had both Sachs and APT, and those are the open symbols there. And after doing, and we plot this as size extracted from APT as a function of size extracted from Sachs, assuming that Sachs has no distortion and is a good reference. So we should be on the diagonal there, and there is a strong deviation there. And we also added data from the literature, in which case we don't really control the way they extracted these sizes in both cases, but still we have the same trend, where for large sizes we are well on the diagonal, and for small sizes we diverge from this diagonal. And this is very consistent with some sort of Gaussian effective spatial resolution that has a width of about 2 sigma equals 1 nanometer. Okay, so everything goes as if we had a spatial resolution in APT for precipitation that is about 1 nanometer in width, which is potentially larger than most people would expect. So this is my last slide, actually. If you want to, it's probably a good idea to, once you have this, to try to assess what would be the effects of this resolution on actual precipitates. And I did some very quick and dirty simulations with simulated volumes with 100% solutes in these volumes. So on the left, this is not even simulations. This is really a sketch, a 2D sketch. But on the right, these are really simulations where I try to show the examples of this 1 nanometer resolution on idealized proxygrams, for instance, or cluster identification. And in both cases, we see that the effect's actually pretty heavy, even on even on a 1D concentration profile. We can see that for objects that are smaller than 2 nanometers in radius, so that's 4 nanometers in diameter, the concentration at the core is already altered, so we don't obtain the 100% solutes. And for, say, 1 nanometer in diameter, so that's the green one, we have as low as 20% instead of 100%. And this is even worse in case of cluster identification, where you use the average of the concentration of all the atoms that you've identified as the clusters, where even for objects that are as big as 8 nanometers in radius, so 16 nanometers in diameter, the average concentration will already be 90% rather than 100%. And for much smaller, you see here the 2 nanometer diameter, it's already 30%. So a much stronger effect than probably would have been expected. And for this, with this, I thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to answer all your questions.
Great, thank you very much, Fred. It is really like a very detailed experimental work and characterizations of these precipitates. Thank you so much. So, any questions from our audience?
Yes, could I ask one small question about I think in the first few slides, when you're talking about a micro hardness, how did you measure that?
So is it these ones?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is it's a very standard micro hardness rig, which is all automatic. So that's the good point. So you don't have to worry too much about doing the measurements. So it's a very standard 100 gram, I think, micro hardness, and you just program the scan and you let it work.
Okay, so it interprets by the simulation directly.
Oh no! This is a measurement. This is 100% measurement.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So can I ask one question? So it's about the magnesium microalloying.
Yes.
And how much magnesium is it added?
It's 0.1%.
0.1%. And did you talk about so magnesium will introduce some new, like maybe nucleation phase, like a new phase?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But in fact, I actually probably deleted a slide by error, which is supposed to be behind this one. But the general idea is that by TEM, these precursors we've observed by atom probe. So what you see here in orange is a magnesium isosurface, and you see that it's sort of curled around an object which is likely to be a dislocation. Yeah. So there's actually an increase of magnesium and copper at the dislocations. And if you don't put magnesium, you don't have these magnesium at dislocations, obviously, because there's no magnesium. And the results after aging is that what you mostly see are theta prime and not T1s.
Yeah.
And these theta primes will actually be mostly associated with the dislocations. So what we conclude from this is that the effect of magnesium is not really to favor T1s, but it's to saturate the dislocations in order to not favor theta primes. Okay, so it's really some sort of negative effects for theta primes. So it sort of kills the dislocation, the nucleation of theta primes. And because of that, because they're competing on the same copper, it's really T1 that will form.
I see. Okay, thanks. And also on the, I think it's page 6. So about the streaks in the diffraction patterns. Yeah, 6. And or 8 maybe. So it's like that's the alignments of maybe this one. That's the alignments of those experimental plates, like those precipitates. Do those always correspond to your like in your diffraction patterns, the red beach?
Well, that's the most important question, of course, when you study this kind of thing.
Yeah.
In many cases, what you will end up with is really this kind of patterns where you have streaks everywhere and you can't really exploit it.
Yeah.
So there are two cases we can exploit. One case is perfectly random, where you'll average everything and that'll be fine. And the other case is single crystal, and which is essentially the TEM case.
Yeah.
And in intermediate case, you'll have to make assumptions. In this case here, this is the case of laminated rolled sheets, really. So they've been rolled. These alloys are usually done like this. So they have this typical rolling texture, which is brass texture, where the plane of the sheets are actually 110 planes of the aluminum. And because they're 110 planes, as you can see for this TEM orientation, 110 is actually the viewing orientation, which is the best for preparing TEM samples and observing these precipitates, because two variants are actually perpendicular. So in this case, when you prepare a SAC sample by chance, really, but it's a chance that is very frequent, because it's the very common rolling texture of aluminum. By chance, these there are two variants that are actually perpendicular, and we see the streaks very well. So it's really chances. If you cut a sample in another direction, then you'll have to make other assumptions or rely on chance, on luck.
Okay. And what's the pixel size for this scanning of this diffraction?
So here, this is not scanning. This is a single image. So what you do is you send your beam on your sample. So your analyzed volume is the size of your beam.
Yeah.
And the size of the beam is about 100 microns or less at a synchrotron.
Yeah.
And in the lab, it would be more 1 millimeter.
I see. Okay.
And if you want to do it in neutrons, it will be more 1 centimeter. So really, that really depends. And if you want to do scanning, as we did here, so here I've shown one every 9 images, really. But normally I have 1 image every 250 microns. So 4 images per millimeters.
Yeah, I see. Wow.
So for this map, there are actually 5,000 images.
Wow, that's a lot of work. So I think this resolution is a bit. So you don't really know the grain size effect. This is more about the precipitates.
Yes. So that's exactly, and it's actually it's actually a problem because there is a change. As I told you, there is an effect of the texture, and here there is a zone which is completely recrystallized, a zone which is not affected mechanically, and there is a zone which is a bit mixed, where there is some sort of deformation. So the texture is actually changing when you interpret the map. So all the challenge is to be able to find a way to interpret your SACS data without spending 2 hours per image. So finding some sort of a way that works for everything, for every image. And that sometimes sometimes works less well. So usually you have to, typically we extract less information from this kind of maps with 10,000 image than from a single well obtained image like this. Because here we have also thousands of images from the in situ experiment, but they all in the same texture, the same orientation, the same texture, etc. Yeah. That's one of the advantage of in situ, is that you are in a single condition from the beginning right up to the end.
Yeah, but this is a good way to do this, to study this.
Yeah.
Thanks. So any more questions from our audience? If not, may I ask the last one? So you mentioned about the mismatch between APT and your SACS size.
Yes.
So why is that? So for the very last point.
Yes. Well, that's it's pretty simple, really. Well, simple in a way, but there is a variety of mechanisms that explain this, but clearly the fact that atoms actually don't appear exactly at the position where they were at the surface of the tip, simply because of evaporation effect. Usually they move a little bit before evaporating, and so their position can actually cross from one neighbor to the other, and because of this, the local environments of each atom is actually lost. This is not true everywhere, because in some at some positions on your sample, you will have a very high spatial resolution, and you will maintain, of course, the local environment, and you will maintain the resolution of atomic planes, etc. But the thing is, these are very localized positions, and when you have a very large data set with many precipitates, and you interpret it as a whole, the effective spatial resolution of the whole system is dominated not by the very good depth spatial resolution of atom probe, but actually by the a bit less good lateral spatial resolution of atom probe. So in 3D, the dominating spatial resolution of atom probe is actually the one that is less good, which is the lateral spatial resolution. It's still very good. I mean, we're speaking 1 nanometer, which is excellent. They're not only excellent, it's unique. There is nothing that can give you the 3D composition of a material at 1 nanometer resolution. But it's slightly over what manufacturer will tend to let you think. So it's important to keep this in mind, and especially to compare this 1 nanometer value with values that you will inject in, let's say, maximum separation method or any cluster search method, because you will typically use values of about point something nanometer, okay, which are actually lower than this resolution. Yeah. So it's important to keep this in mind when working with this, because again, this is a noise. This is a shuffling of the atoms. It doesn't mean you don't detect clusters. It means you shuffle them. So you need to keep in mind what will. I mean, if you have very small cluster, you will still detect it, but it will look much broader and much less concentrated. So you just need to keep this in mind when analyzing. That's it.
Okay. See. So, but are you saying like the blue data points is a bit more reliable for this larger size? Just give for this plot.
You mean this? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, normally, as you can see, the blue points there are the same as the red one there.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so this is why they're very well aligned here.
Yeah, I see.
And they're slightly lower for the bigger ones. And this is because of local magnification. Actually, these precipitates are low field, so they appear very dense. And so they appear a bit smaller than they are. This is why they're a bit lower than the diagonal.
Yeah.
But if you look at this broadly, they're actually still very good. They compare very well with SAC. So it's actually a very good result.
Yeah.
But for lower cases, especially for clusters, what Atom Prober call clusters,
yeah,
you have to be careful.
I see. But it's given like look at your y-axis. This size, like for my perspective, I never measure size, but it's as fine as this. So it's good work. Thank you.
Well, in any case, if there are no more questions or whatever, I put back my email and you can still contact me, ask me any questions. I'm very open to questions. Don't hesitate.
Okay, great.
Sometimes the questions come after because you digest the presentation.
Yeah. Oh, so as we discussed before, like we might send you a link of a recording of this talk.
Yes.
If you can approve that, if you may approve it, then we can upload it to YouTube for more people to see it.
Yeah,
so
no problem.
I'll email you later about that, more information.
No problem.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone as well for attending today. So
yeah, thank you all.
The rest of your day. Thank you, Fred.
Bye-bye.
Bye.